Petrograd, Russia, 12:15 a.m., 1915. The moon shone full and bright in the starry night sky, illuminating the majestic city of Petrograd, the capital of the Tsarist Russian Empire, home to the gleaming Winter Palace. Petrograd's dark streets were lit only by the faint glow of street lamps, which cast long, dark shadows over its worn cobblestone roads. Though it was well after midnight, Petrograd was bustling with activity, as a busy crowd was out and about, walking briskly up and down the sidewalk past storefronts and taverns. They wore thick fur coats and floppy fur hats to ward off the harsh, biting cold of October. Most of the shops in the city were closed at such a late hour, with only a few general stores remaining open to serve the odd late-night shopper. The flickering glow of oil lamps flooded through store windows, illuminating the sidewalk outside. The city's vagrants and beggars were out in force, standing before the closed shops and loitering outside taverns, where they could hear the faint echo of drunken singing from within as the liquor began to flow freely. The beggars hoped to be able to convince these drunken patrons to hand over their remaining coin, thinking that their impaired judgment might pay off. While the beggars begged, the vagrants and pickpockets watched the crowds who walked by, leaning silently against the windows of the general store, looking for anyone who looked as if they might be rich. It was a good night for them, as there were many people of means walking the streets, dressed in their finest clothes. They were traveling to a popular opera house to hear Tchaikovsky's symphony, as well as a number of other composers. Carriages traveled down the road, bumping and rattling along, their passengers oblivious to the people outside. Among the crowd of bustling people, a young woman blended in, walking in the same direction, bound for the Alexandrinsky Opera House, to hear the music of the famous composer. She wore a long black dress, paired with a black shawl, which she fastened with a silver brooch, one with a golden double-headed eagle depicted on it. Her face was covered by a gold tragedy mask, similar to the one seen in classical theater. She said nothing to anyone, walking silently forward. The rest of the crowd was noisy and boisterous, shouting and drawing attention to themselves. This served to the young woman's benefit, allowing her to remain unnoticed. Just one person among a sea of people. Ahead of her, a young pickpocket walked behind a well-dressed man. The pickpocket was in his mid-20s and had failed to notice the woman in the gold mask. He silently robbed the well-dressed man in front of him, stealing a silver pocket watch from his back pocket. The masked woman saw this and said nothing, choosing not to draw attention to herself. The man who had been robbed was a wealthy banker, with connections among the elite. He failed to notice the theft and kept right on walking. The pickpocket quickly fell back in the crowd, eager to put distance between himself and his mark, who might realize his watch was gone at any moment. The thief was surprised when he felt a light touch upon his arm. "I saw you take the watch. You needn't fear. I'll tell no one of it," whispered the young woman, her breath hot on his ear. Before the thief could react, she slipped a silver coin into his hand and took the watch from him, vanishing back into the crowd without another word, leaving him puzzled as to what had just happened. The Romanov Palace, 7:30 p.m., 1905. Anastasia Romanov looked down at the object on the table, a silver coin her father had placed there. The coin had the emblem of the double-headed Romanov eagle upon it. Anastasia was young, hardly above the age of 7. She wore a white nightgown, one that clung loosely to her small frame. Her feet were clad in soft, fuzzy slippers. It was late, well past her time to go to bed, as her sisters had already done. Anastasia knew that her sisters were asleep. She could sense how they felt. She knew when her sister Olga was having a nightmare, or when Maria pricked her finger sewing. Anastasia had no idea how she knew these things. Her father called it a gift, the second sight. She felt a strong hand clasp her shoulder, looking up to see her father, Tsar Nicholas II. He stood to her right, clad in his military uniform, a serious look in his eyes. One hand rested upon the hilt of his saber. "I need you to do it again," he directed, pointing at the coin. "What is it, Father? What do I need to do?" she inquired, looking up at him with wide, green eyes. "Move the coin, Anastasia, like you did before, without touching it," he replied. He had heard of her doing so before, but wanted to see it for himself. Anastasia focused on the coin, which began to slide back and forth across the table, moving so fast that it was a blur. Her father gasped, taking a few steps back from her. Anastasia stopped what she was doing, glancing over at him with alarm. "What is it, Father? Are you upset?" she inquired. Tsar Nicholas tried to calm his pounding heart as he cleared his throat. "No, child. I'm just surprised. You may head up to bed now. You did very well. We'll talk more tomorrow," he replied. Anastasia got up from where she sat, making her way past her father and towards the room's exit. As she was about to leave, a small black shape moving in the corner of the room caught her eye. Anastasia turned her head, seeing a rat sniffing around in the corner. Her father noticed the rat at the same time she did, growling with disgust. "Vile creature! I'll have the servants place traps," he declared. Before he had time to react, the silver coin flew off the table, sailing across the room so quickly that Nicholas hardly had time to see it. The coin acted as a deadly missile, striking the tiny rat in the neck, cleaving its head off before lodging itself in the wall. "There you are, Father. Now you've nothing to worry about," stated Anastasia. She then exited the room, leaving her father with a shocked expression on his face at just how easily she had killed, without even really trying. Nicholas watched her go, wondering what potential she might have. Petrograd, Russia, 12:25 a.m., 1915. Enzo Ricci stood before the Alexandrinsky Theater, looking up at its fine architecture. The theater towered above him with its strong, stone features, having a distinctly Romanesque appearance, reminding him of ruins he had seen in Florence during his youth, the remains of Roman temples which still stood after centuries had passed. He was not alone. A crowd had gathered at the theater, there for the same reason he was. Enzo had traveled out to hear Tchaikovsky's symphony, which was renowned in Russia. A longtime client of his had recommended it to him after a successful business deal. Enzo made his way slowly through the crowd, having purchased his ticket earlier. The crowd which encircled him was very lively and boisterous, shouting and yelling at each other. It took him a few moments to get to the ticket counter, which had been blocked by the crowd who were tightly clustered around it. Upon pushing his way through the crowd and reaching the ticket counter, Enzo produced his ticket, handing it to a uniformed employee who punched holes in it before handing it back to him with a smile. "You'll be seated in box B32. Enjoy your evening," he informed. Enzo walked past him, entering the theater. He was relieved to find that it was much more peaceful inside the theater. The shouting crowds had been left outside, replaced by quiet guests who milled about, searching for their assigned seats. He could still faintly hear the crowd outside as he stood near the entrance, ticket in hand. Enzo quickened his pace, wanting to reach his seat before the show started. He made his way quickly through the theater's lobby, passing by fellow patrons who had arrived just before he did. Mostly young women and older men, dressed in their evening wear. A majority of the younger men had been called away to the front. Those few present were officers on leave, who had come to hear the symphony. None of them noticed him, a middle-aged man, dressed in black, with a bowler hat perched atop his head. The lobby was tastefully decorated with red, black, and gold, reminding him of other large theaters he had traveled to before arriving in Russia to pursue his career as a banker. Enzo made his way to the second floor of the theater, searching for box B32. By the time he reached it, the concert had almost begun. He sat down in his seat, looking down at the wide stage below, where the orchestra was preparing to play, prepping and testing their instruments. For a moment, he relaxed, leaning back into his seat. Then a voice broke the silence. "Good evening, Enzo," stated a young woman. Enzo snapped his head in her direction, looking at the woman who had spoken to him. His heart skipped a beat upon seeing her. She wore an unnerving-looking mask, one which sent chills down his spine. The golden mask resembled an old comedy mask, one of a pair worn by ancient Greek actors. The woman wore a long black dress and had a silver brooch. "Why are you lurking over there in that mask? Are you here to rob me?" he inquired, glaring over at her. The woman lowered her mask, staring at Enzo with piercing eyes. Enzo's eyes went wide when he recognized who she was. Anastasia Romanov, one of the Tsar's daughters. He quickly regretted his choice of words. "What on earth are you doing here? Does your father know you're here?" he stammered. Anastasia pulled her bizarre mask back down, rolling her eyes. "Of course he does. Who do you think sent me?" she replied in a condescending tone. She then reached into her pocket, producing an envelope, which she held up to Enzo. "Father is less than pleased with you. You've been giving money to our enemies who attempt to undermine us. Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" she stated, looking at him with disgust. Enzo shook his head rapidly. "No, that's a lie," he retorted. His hands shook with rage, and he wondered just how the Tsar knew of his treasonous acts. Anastasia pulled a thick wad of American dollars from the envelope, holding them up for Enzo to see. "We recovered this from a Bolshevik arms dealer. When pressed for details, he gave us your name. He said you acted as a go-between for the Bolsheviks and a wealthy banker," she informed. The orchestra began to play, the opening chords to the Rite of Spring, humming in the background. Enzo said nothing in reply, choosing to stare down at his feet. "Give me the name of this banker, Enzo. It's the only way to help yourself," Anastasia demanded. Enzo felt his blood run cold. He had to escape from Russia before the Tsar captured him. He looked at Anastasia, wondering why on earth the Tsar had sent a lone young woman to catch him. She was small, and he was certain he could push past her and run if he had to, though he suspected the police would be waiting for him outside if he did. Enzo stood up from his seat, preparing to flee. "Stop," demanded Anastasia. She stayed seated and made no attempt to pursue him. Enzo ignored her, turning his back on her with a sneer. "I'm leaving here, girl. Don't try and stop me. I don't want to hurt you," he replied. Enzo took a single step. Then, his chest exploded with pain. This stopped him in his tracks, forcing him to sit back down as he struggled to catch his breath. He had no idea what had just happened, thinking that he might have had a heart attack. The orchestra continued to play below them, as Anastasia watched him, staring at him on the opposite side of her mask. None of the other patrons of the opera house were aware of what was happening, as they were all focused on the orchestra. "I warned you not to run. Try that again, and it will be even worse," she warned. Enzo gave her a shocked look. "What on earth are you on about? I'm having a heart attack. Why don't you run and fetch help?" he gasped. Anastasia shook her head. "That was no heart attack. I told you not to run," she replied. Enzo felt a chill run down his spine. He looked over at Anastasia. "What are you saying? Did you do that to me? How is that possible?" he shouted. Anastasia leaned in close to him, staring deep into his eyes. There was a detached coldness to her gaze, one Enzo didn't like at all. He could see his pale face reflected in her gold mask. "I can feel your heart beating, just as I can sense the confusion and anger growing within you," she whispered. Tell me who gave you the money. Perhaps then father might have you exiled rather than hung," demanded Anastasia.
"I'll tell you nothing. I've no idea what vile witchcraft you wield, but it will not save your dynasty," retorted Enzo.
Anastasia's expression darkened. "Is that your final answer for me?" she replied. Enzo nodded.
"Your father can do what he likes. I'll tell you nothing," he spat.
Enzo once again rose to his feet, determined to flee. He made it no further than a few steps before he was brought to his knees. The pain in his chest flared up stronger than ever, making it so he could barely breathe. As he fell to the ground, Anastasia rose from her seat, walking over to stand above him, looking down at him with a pitiless glare. The orchestra continued to play with growing intensity, oblivious to what was happening. "Last chance. Tell me who sent the money. Which bank in New York?" she demanded. Enzo gasped for air, feeling the pain in his chest die down just enough to speak.
"What are you?"
he hissed, pointing a single wrinkled finger at her. He now knew that he had no way to escape. Whatever power the girl possessed was beyond him. His vision began to fade, as did his hearing, the chaotic orchestra slowly fading into silence. Now Enzo had no strength to talk, or even move. His last thoughts were of the girl who stood above him, wearing her frowning golden mask, her eyes devoid of emotion. The rest of the orchestra went on without incident. Anastasia watched it from seat B32, ignoring the still figure who sat across from her, his head laid on his chest, as if he had fallen asleep in his seat. When the production ended, she clapped along with the other patrons before taking her leave, leaving Enzo behind to be found by staff. She knew that he would not be the last man she killed, as her father had many more enemies. And a big thanks to my patrons, Miriam, Dan, Jacob, Teddy Dog, Shoji, Katie, Patricia, and the Reptile. Thanks so much for making the decision to support my channel.